It's great to be here, great to be in person with first time in a long time. So my disclosure slides, the main thing here is that I actually am a patient of many years, and I would actually found myself in many of those bins that Jack was just talking about. So I was quickly, yeah. DMARDs, during the pandemic, I got so excited when I started hearing on NPR in the morning talking about DMARDs. It meant that the world, the biggest jargon word that we deal with every day, the rest of the world was learning about. Of course, they forgot about it a day later. But still, that still is one of the main decision-making processes when you're dealing with a patient with RA. When my time at Stanford with Jim Freeze, he was always, before a journal club, mentioning the three things you should take into account when it came to a DMARD, which is the efficacy, the toxicity, and the cost. And I also wanted to mention Jim because he passed this last December, but he did this paper in 1999 that sort of expressed his opinion, and there's a whole bunch of things here. And basically, I think this is sort of a multiple dissertations in one, but it seems like everything we talk about is in one of these boxes. And one of the many things, this is probably not something I want to do a talk about, but I do want to mention a few things here. Failure to sequence treatment optimally, failure to consistently follow suppressive strategy. Now, who failed here? Was it the patient or the rheumatologist? But I also didn't find any papers that actually took these three things into account. I did a search, and the only thing that showed up was this one that was published a couple years ago, did a 3D plot here with the costs on the z-axis. Down here we have the efficacy, and over here safety. And then they've chosen 3 or 4 of these Chinese traditional medicines that were chosen to be sort of the optimal here. And why don't we do this here? Because in the US, we usually never talk about cost. It's anathema. But still, what I wanted to point out is sort of the thing that wasn't mentioned here is adherence. And I sort of reframed the words that we use here, sort of the efficacy, safety not toxicity now, and adherence are the main factors that lead to the effectiveness of a medication. And so we always are most interested in the most effective medication for our patients. And then the costs are somebody else's issue, right? So adherence, this is sort of the technical definition, the process by which patients take their medicines as prescribed. So I know as a patient, I sometimes get very different things on the prescription than what I'm actually told in person, but that's a different matter. So the initiation is when the drug was first taken. So there's actually a whole process between what you prescribe to the patient to when they take it somewhere, when it's actually dispensed, when they actually get it in their hands, they can then get it for the first time. The implementation is, does that dose match what the prescription is? And then discontinuation when last taken. So these things there's sort of a science here beyond us. Pharmionics was the term used. I haven't seen this term taken off yet, but I like it. Medications do not work in patients who do not take them. This was promoted for a long time after the WHO did a big study in 2003 showing that there's only 50% adherence to long-term medications. Increasing the effectiveness of adherence interventions may have a far greater impact on the health of the population than any new improvement in scientific medical treatments. I haven't seen there's lots of follow-ups to this, but let's do this question here first. How adherent to DMARDs are your patients? There is a correct answer to this, but it might be different for one of you than the person next to you. I'm glad Jack asked the questions early because I needed all 3 before I could log in properly and to answer the right one. And since I can make comments during this question time, I think the sleep study is highly underutilized when it comes to a follow-up for bad patients there. And we have a lot of sleep studies showing that, but all right, moving along. So that's correct. Basically, it's somewhere around 80% or 50%, depending on what type of patient they're at and where they're at. And it's spot on. And the WHO was not meant to throw you off because a lot of times actually it is 50%. And yeah, I'll carry on a little bit more. So when I talk to a lot of the doctors that I work with, they basically would just say, the patients take what I prescribed. It's great. They do exactly what I tell them, which is, there's no follow-up, right? It's just sort of assumed at 100%. And then any failure, why things didn't work is because it's the patient's fault, not the doctor's fault here. So we did a couple adherence studies that I'm going to talk about here. One was published a few years ago in ACR Open. Another one was just presented last year at ACR Convergence. And in both cases, we invited participants around the US in the Forward Data Bank. And I'll give you just what already mentioned here. Fred Wolf is my mentor. He started the NDB back in 1998. And he made this statement a few years ago when we were interviewing him. He said, I started the NDB in part to figure out what happened to my patients that didn't come back. And this is something that Jack alluded to but didn't really get to. If you look at your patients long term, if you start collecting measures over and over again, you will find that they do better. What you won't find is what happened to the patients who didn't come back, right? And it is sort of a bias over time because they come back to you because they are doing better and they like what's happening here. And the ones that don't usually don't come back, or unless they don't have another option. And the NDB, I've renamed it Forward a few years ago. It's still an independent nonprofit research organization, and it's still one of the largest, even though we have not recruited new patients through the whole pandemic, so we are hurting that way. I invite you to go to the website down below, forwarddatabank.org. We're always looking for new sites who want to help contribute more patients. But what we did in this process is we followed patients with large questionnaires a couple times a year through the patient, not through the clinics, so we could see what's happening to them over time. And we invited these folks who had started methotrexate, which is hard to find these days because most people have been on already and already failed or have moved on to something else. We started methotrexate. We mailed them a bottle, an electronic cap bottle, a MEMS cap, and then gave them a questionnaire, and 6 months later got the bottle back, and from that we could figure out how adherent they were or not. And this is sort of shows you what that MEMS bottle shows the analyst here. This is an example from, over here we have the tofacitinib monotherapy, and this is somebody who is very adherent and persistent. They took their pill every day in the morning very consistently over 6 months, or 9 months in this case. Here's an example of somebody who was not persistent because they stopped, but they were very adherent. And you can see the methotrexate, which is once a week. And here's somebody you can start seeing overdosing and underdosing, though I don't use the term overdosing in the paper just because it sounds a little too far off. And so forth. This is what we see when we see those MEMS devices. And what we found, for the most part, the correct dosing was around 80%. And then underdosing 20, a little off, and then early dosing instead of overdosing. Which is a little scary when it comes to methotrexate, as it should be. And it surprised me because these are already biased patients. They've already started the drug, so they've already initiated it. In some cases, they've been taking it for months already. And even people who've been taking it, adherence was at 80%. So this just would be like your best case scenario. Only 25% of the people in there took it consistently correct, same day, once a week for 6 months. And these are like the best of the best. So I put 80% adherence as the top, like what you could expect of your best patients. And it's most likely to be closer to 50%. In the recent study from last fall, we looked at tofacitinib. Now this is versus sub-Q TNF. And again, very similar results. And then we found a little bit of difference with the methotrexate that was concomitant with either that helped improve, which surprised me. And the summary of this is that the adherence to tofacitinib is about the same as TNF sub-Q injectables. And this is like a big bottle with a big cap on top that they deposit in. That methotrexate improved tofacitinib adherence. It doesn't mean you should prescribe methotrexate to people who are taking tofacitinib. I think this means that these are folks who are used to taking methotrexate consistently, and therefore they're used to taking pills. We did find that if you took your tofa and methotrexate either way in the morning, you were more adherent than in the evening. Why is that? Because it's one of the first things you do, right? In the morning with breakfast, you have it there as part of your schedule. You can control it. You never know when you're going to have dinner sometimes. It might be off, depending where you're at. That's my reasoning there. You sort of see we call them wobblers, the folks who do it in the afternoon or evening. And what Jack alluded to is the patient global was the most important factor in predicting discontinuation and poor adherence. Patient global. As far as things that you might be able to control, age, sex, and race were also important. So, what do you do to ensure good initiation and adherence to the medications you prescribed? This is a poll. Do you debrief on the medication plan with the patient? You can answer multiple choices this time. Do you use an adherence tool in your clinic? Do you pull pharmacy dispensing records? Do you have a follow-up outreach beyond the clinic visit about getting the medications? Do you rely on a PBM, a pharmacy benefit manager, specialty pharma, and big pharma? Do you cross your fingers and hope for the best, i.e., your patients do exactly what you tell them to do? So, in the US at least, everybody relies on pharma now, on the specialty meds, believe it or not. So, debrief, that's great. And that's good. That's definitely a start. It's a good sign. Outreach beyond, that's fantastic. For the most part, those of us who are on things that aren't over-the-counter, easy-to-access pharmacy, DMARDs, CSDMARDs, we deal with the specialty pharmacy, we deal with other phone calls and emails and texts as a patient all the time. And what you may or may not know is we're dealing with nurses now that are asking about how we're doing that have nothing to do with my rheumatologist. And most of the time, they don't even know that we're having these interactions. But the drug companies want to make sure that the patients stay on these drugs. And so therefore, we end up talking to these folks more than we actually talk to the rheumatology clinic. And they've done this to improve adherence because you don't have time to do so. But debriefing on the medication plan is fantastic. So we talked about changing therapy. You want an efficacious DMARD. You want to treat to target strategy. Get great outcomes. Fantastic. We've got it. No problem. Real world evidence is not so fast. And back in 2007, Fred and I published this paper called Resistance of RA Patients to Changing Therapy. And the main results of this is that we found so many people who had poor disease control, worse disease activity in RA, were not taking the new, at that time, biologics. And we didn't understand why it was happening. The biggest reason was the patients feared loss of control and the worse getting worse. The idea that they could be okay with sort of this moderate disease activity as long as it sort of seemed to be stable at some level. And that you kept on finding all of these swollen joints that weren't being addressed. So we did a follow-up to this last year. We got the data last year, presented at ACR. I'm not going to go through the whole study because there's about 40 single-space pages of this, and I'm still getting all ready for publication. But we found very similar results. What this is showing is what things seem to stay the same and the strongest is that the risk of side effects, the doctors think the current medications are the best, and the fear of loss of control, and there's no better medication, are by far the strongest associated with refusing to consider a change in DMARD. Because it's one thing for you to think the patient needs a different drug, it's another thing for them to actually take it. And then over here we have a spidergram sort of looking at all the different questions here. And I'll move on here. The main results here is that between the 2006 and the 2021 update, and this showed when I actually paired the people who actually filled out both questionnaires, so it is definitely a longer-lived subset, that the satisfaction with medications had increased over time. The satisfaction with control has decreased, which sort of goes against each other. Unwilling to change has decreased, and that we see this happening more and more when there's more drugs available and more likely you've changed and tried more drugs. Very satisfied with medications, yet high disease activity. It's pretty high. So we had 35% high disease activity, yet very satisfied with medications. And yet similar weaker associations, the cost insurance factors seem to have disappeared compared to 2006. And I mean, I think as a patient for me, I went from having to pay 20% of my drug cost to now like $5 a month, which is a huge change for me. And it's not that the drugs got lowered, it's just very different how those things are paid for. There is a resistance by mechanism of action, and then whether it's sub-Q or IV as well. So, in summary, the physician global changes the DMARD prescription. So what your gestalt is on the patient is what most likely leads to a DMARD change. But I want to push out there that the patient global changes whether or not they stay on those drugs. So if you're not measuring that, you should be. I think a lot of people asked if they do a depression question. I think that just 1 or 2 mood questions will sometimes help as well, sort of that approach, because mood definitely impacts, your mood impacts how you're doing today with the patient, let alone here. The same with the patient as well, what they're going to remember. Many factors impact treatment effectiveness. Don't let you or your clinic negatively impact them. And this really goes back to that communication and education. So what are some of the pros? Like with methotrexate, the fast, easy one without even thought should be, what's your methotrexate day? If they don't have a quick answer, you might need to have a longer conversation about what they're doing correctly about their once a day methotrexate. Same with the sub-Q biologics. If it's once every week or once every 2 weeks, what's your injection day? When they should know that and have it down as a single day. If it's all over the place or whenever they feel like it, you should have a little more conversation. I know that I start to get worried when I start to get sore and oh, I missed it. It was on my calendar, but Saturdays. So that's all for this. I do want to follow up with this because this was just put out this last year and sort of re-emphasize the importance of adherence. And this is a policy statement, and I want to read it all out because I found it so fitting for us. Adherence to medical therapy is complex and involves multiple and overlapping parameters and levels of interaction. Each patient may have a complex set of health beliefs, socioeconomic difficulties, memory loss, and depression. In parallel, providers are as complex as the patients they care for, and only by first recognizing the presence of non-adherence in a non-judgmental way will patients and providers together discover specific solutions supported by appropriate policy and systems change. I mention that because you are not simple robots either, otherwise we wouldn't have jobs here. And that what goes into the patient decision-making process is incredibly complex. The day of the visit, the 5 minutes that you have with the patient to how much time the other staff has with it, all things to take into account. I like to think that I'm amazing at being adherent to my drugs, but I've had 40-some years of practice, right? And I finally found something that works for me. But then things weren't working, and what happened along things that sort of led to those bumps, and so reaching the next plateau for me as an individual patient. But I'm incredibly active in my own self-care. And a lot of times you're going to figure out who's going to have the most decision-making process with the patient. Is it the patient themselves or someone that they live with, or who's going to be following up with them, or if you can't do it yourself? So thank you for that. I'm welcoming questions.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Kaleb. Here's a question. Is Forward only for the U.S., or can it be used internationally?
It is used in other countries, but there's a bias in other countries because those folks only come in through online. I think we do have, in Canada, we can mail, and we have phone call interviews, over mail questionnaires, and online as well.
Okay.
But it's primarily U.S. Jack.
Kaleb, what do you think about the use of drug levels to identify patients who may be non-adherent? And then what's the conversation like? Aha, I caught you, fess up.
So I personally love it, but nobody uses it in the U.S. that I know of. Every time I talk to somebody in the U.S., no. But I've seen the studies that come out of Europe, and for somehow they can get access to these tests for $5 or $10. I'm like, wait a minute, why? Because for me, it's not necessarily the drug levels. I want to know about anti-drug antibodies, because that's going to impact the efficacy. And if you combine those, you're going to one is going to sort of give the other at some level as well. I think if you put that, patients, as a patient, love lab tests, because you could, instead of feeling like, how are you feeling today? You're like, oh, look at that. Now I know what I have to do. Right? You've done these patient support groups and panels, and they say the first thing they want to see is what does the blood test show? Because that gives them some sense that there's something happening beyond all their sort of control, and what they're doing is having a difference. So I think putting that in there is not really to get you gotcha. It's like, oh, so this either means your body's not processing it or you're not getting it in the right time. So let's talk about this. And so it's not about guilt. It's not making them feel bad. It's about, like, what can we do to improve this? Why would you maybe not want to take it? Is it not getting to your door? You're not getting it? Because there's lots of other things stopping it from actually getting to them. Or like, I really, it hurts, or I don't like it, or something else that they're not telling you about because they're afraid of it, right? So like what we get in our questionnaires are not, I lie to the specialty pharmacies all the time because I just need to get the drug. But I felt the questionnaires in forward, like it's sort of after the fact, and I can tell them what I did and when, what I did as opposed to what I might tell the doctor. So I think that the conversation, that relationship with the doctor is very different than what it might be with the pharmacy to get what we need.
Kaleb, I've been dying to ask you, in the clinic, I ask patients when they take a medicine. And I had always thought that if someone said, well, I take it every Thursday, that meant they probably were taking it. Whereas if they say, I'm taking it, well, just like it says on the thing. But then a student told me, no, that's not true. That you can't use the assurance with which people tell you what day and time they take a medicine as a measure of compliance. Has anyone ever looked at that?
Anecdotally, yes. I think on this one, we're relying a lot on the people where they're at, what they bring into the clinic. It really varies by the relationship. That's why the 80%, I would say, is actually closer to 50% in reality once you put it to your overall patients. But I think if they say, I take it at this time, at this date, you're pretty confident they're probably doing okay. Now, if they say that and you do drug levels and it's really low, like, well, there's something not happening here, and it's worth following up on it. But I do think that the morning time was a nice little pearl that we pulled out. The people who had success were people who could get it in the morning. And sometimes people avoid the morning because it hurts their stomach. They have GI things. Well, get some breakfast. Try to get something that might work for you, or at least have an alarm or something set.
Dr. Zach.
One of the things that I don't know if you guys, not too many people even measure methotrexate levels, methotrexate polyglutamate levels, but if you just look at all the samples in a given set that have been measured, there's only about 20% that are in therapeutic range. So I'm wondering if, that's something, 80% adherence, but are they on the wrong dose?
Yeah, I'm at Nebraska, and Jim Odell is my chief, and he harps on this all the time. Like, that means that study was okay, but they never were at the proper methotrexate levels, right? And I think it's really getting that titrated to where it can be. But again, it's a test that how often do you do it, and how easy is it to get that test? But I think it's definitely worthwhile to consider.
There's a couple of questions on asking your advice on improving compliance and adherence, and one about diary apps. Are they helpful?
Anything that the patient uses that they find helpful is helpful. But there's about 40 different apps on the phone that you could, at least, and I've written on about 100 of them, but they come and go because it takes a lot of time and effort to keep these things maintained. But I have my own system. I have my own pill bottles that I can't seem to buy anymore on things, and I've been looking at other mechanisms of doing it. But I found something that works for me currently. If you don't have something that's working with you consistent, where you feel like this is a jumble and sort of like on the fly, you're having to think about what you're supposed to take, you're probably not doing it right. I take about 15 medicines a week, and I've got a good system. But I imagine other folks, a few years as my kids get older, I might have a lot harder time managing it.
Here's a question about cost and incomplete compliance. Some patients stretch medication because by taking the drug less or increasing the interval, specifically for cost issues.
Yeah, that's a source of frustration. In the U.S., at least, it's been very much easier for patients to get the more expensive medications covered. Like I said, I mentioned I pay $5 a month because I have an insurance plan that helps do that, but also there's the pharmaceutical company sort of contributes to that, so to reduce the out-of-pocket costs. And we've seen this in forward, the out-of-pocket costs have come down dramatically over time in the actual drug costs. But the drug costs themselves are still, and that's another conversation. But I've seen that. I've also seen it where the doctor says, well, I'm going to prescribe this, but you should take it as needed. Or I'm going to prescribe this, but you have to take it once a week, but if you want to take it once every 2 weeks because you don't need as much, that's fine as well. If you're not getting the full benefit, and you see that a lot of the ones that are sort of titrated, you can see the blood, how much are in the body as far as in the blood levels, that I can feel it when I'm a few days off. That means the drug's probably working with me. If somebody's trying to stretch it out as long as they can, it means it's probably working for them at some level too. It's just trying to find another solution. Each one's going to be different.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was great.